Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to 101 East's Twitter chat and Google Hangout. We are tweeting under the hashtag Pakistan Drugs, and I'm joined by our filmmaker Karishma Vyas, who has made this fantastic and powerful film. Karishma, it's been haunting me all weekend having seen this film, and you've got some amazing people and some amazing access in this. Tell me, how did it all come about? How did you get in touch with drug addicts who were so young?
Well, interestingly, I was in the beginning of the film when we hadn't started shooting yet. I was very focused on another organization, and they worked mostly with adults, and sometimes had children coming in. But I was keen to actually follow them and a group called the Eddie Foundation that for many years has been working with drug addicts in Pakistan. But our associate producer, Hani Taha, said that she knew of an organization that works specifically with young drug addicts. And I thought that was really interesting, and it would make a really powerful film because you don't really associate, 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds with having drug addictions. And it interested me. It kind of, like my curiosity was kind of piqued by this, and I thought, well, if I'm interested in this, then other people must be as well. So we went down that road.
Well, thanks for coming on and talking to us about it. You can tweet us under the hashtag on Twitter, Pakistan Drugs, and Karishma is happy to answer any questions about the shoot. 6 million drug users apparently in Pakistan, Karishma. The one that you followed specifically at the start of this film is 14-year-old Shahzad, and he had quite a tale to tell about how he started with cigarettes and smoking hashish, and then may have even moved to harder drugs, and that was the concern. Can you give us an update? The film sort of showed that he had a relapse during your filming, and then afterwards it's kind of left hanging to see what's happened. I think it's probably been about 6 weeks or more than a month since you shot. Can you give us an update on how Shahzad's doing now?
Yeah, I mean, it honestly, it was as shocking and surprising for me as it must have been for the viewer when in the last sequence of the film, Shahzad unfortunately relapses, and it was really disappointing for me to see that as well, because I'd gotten to know this young man and gotten to know his family and the hard work they'd put into getting better. And then 2 days before we finished filming, we were at his home, and he relapsed again. So I've since called his caseworker. I remember speaking to her at the time, and she said, well, he's going to have to do the detox again, which is the initial 10 days or so that that they go through when they first join. So he'd gone through the 3 months. He'd made so much progress, and I think honestly nobody was more disappointed or more surprised than Shahzad himself that he could kind of slide back into the habit again after all the counseling and all the work that he'd done at the center. So he has now finished. He had to go back into detox, which was 10 days. He's now finished that, and he's living in a halfway house, which is a separate house run by the same organization for kids that have gone through the initial 3-month detox. And he's living there, and he's doing well. He has not had a relapse since then. But having said that, relapse is a very, very common experience for the children and adults, anybody who's had some kind of dependence, psychological or physical dependence on drugs. It's not a magic cure. Detox and 3 months of treatment is not a magic cure when you're dealing with people who have had this addiction for years. So it's disappointing, but it's not unusual, and the counselors were very careful to not get upset with him, to not yell at him or lecture him about it. It was just part of the process, and he would just have to start again and keep going until he didn't have these relapses.
We're starting to get a lot of tweets coming in under the hashtag Pakistan Drugs. One of them, Shazil K, has said, the drug problem is not that big in Pakistan, that it's just in some unlawful sort of areas. And Fatima is telling us, more rehabilitation centres are not going to uproot the problem. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think there is no one solution to this. I don't think you can say if you have more rehabilitation centers, then then there's not going to be a drug problem. You also still have to deal with the problem of the drugs coming in to Pakistan from Afghanistan. You have to still deal with all the social problems that encourage or facilitate people that fall, that really contribute to them falling into drug addiction. So, but I certainly think rehabilitation is an area that has not been adequately addressed by the Pakistani government. They have just a handful of treatment centers for people, and most of the burden for treatment is actually being taken up by the private sector, which doesn't make sense to me. I mean, if you have such a large drug problem, and this figure of 6.7 million is something that the UNODC and the Pakistani government together have come up with. It's not, a random figure plucked out of the sky. The Pakistani government itself has acknowledged that this is the problem. So when you have such a extensive problem, you have to then put in resources to address that, not just to stop the drugs coming in, but to help the people that have already fallen into that trap, help them to get out of it as well.
One of the other really heartbreaking things that really sort of touched me in the film was the story of Aftab Alam and how he's found on the streets, and he really, has to be convinced to go into rehab, and that sort of question is left hanging. Do you know what's happened to him?
Yes, I spoke to Aftab Alam, to follow up on Amjad's case, and unfortunately, Aftab kind of got him, found a treatment center for him, gave him the information, put him in touch, but so far he has not managed to actually enroll himself in treatment. So he's still in the condition that we left him in, which is really sad, because he was lucky in a lot of ways in that his family supported him. I think it's a common experience for drug addicts, especially heroin addicts, who've been on that drug for so long. I mean, they lose everything, and ultimately many of them lose their families. Their families don't want to have anything to do with them because they have betrayed them, they have lied to them, they have stolen things out of their home. The emotional roller coaster that families go through because of an addiction by one of their loved ones is really terrible and heartbreaking. But Amjad was lucky because his family still supported him. His sisters, his brother, his mother, they all rallied to get him into the treatment program. Now, he says that, this treatment center for adults charges money, a nominal amount, but a lot of the NGOs I spoke with said that they do this so that, the patients are financially invested in their treatment. It's not just something that they're getting for free that they feel they can walk in and out of without much consequence, because they haven't had to put down any money. So, some treatment centers, the ones run by private organizations, will charge a bit of money. So there's an added incentive for patients to complete the program and to stick to it. However, in Amjad's case, and I'm sure in the cases of many drug addicts, it also adds initially, contributes as a bit of a disincentive, because people say they don't have the money, they don't have any money, they're poor, and that seems to be the situation that Amjad is finding himself in right now.
One of the points that I think you made pretty clearly was about this, flood of drugs that's coming across the border from Afghanistan. And just on our hashtag on Twitter, Pakistan Drugs, a lot of people are commenting about that. I think you say it's something like 44 million tons that come into the country. And your assistant producer, Hani Taha's made a good point, that you kind of saw some ingenious methods of drugs sort of being smuggled over the border from Afghanistan. And there's this sort of geopolitical situation going on with that as well. Tell me about that.
Well, actually, I'd just like to clarify. I think estimates of how much drugs is coming into the country and how much is leaving and how much is being consumed are very difficult to come by because it's an illegal trade. And so it's all underground, and, you know, really we've heard estimates of 150 tons coming into the country and 44 tons being consumed. This,
Wow.
again, is the best, yeah, it's the best guess. It could be much more than that. Authorities don't know, and certainly we're not in a position to say that that's definitely how much it is. Now, sorry, I've forgotten your question after my little tangent there.
There were some pretty ingenious methods of
Yes.
smuggling the drugs in. Like you saw them
Yes.
kind of all concealed in the boxes.
Yeah, and you know, that was one of the most fascinating things to me about it, because, you know, I kind of had the impression that people were trying to shove drugs into their socks, in their luggage, or, you know, I understand Afghanistan had a porous border and they were just kind of coming in carrying shopping bags of them or something. I mean, it's very naive, but when I went to the Anti-Narcotics Force headquarters in Karachi, and the commander actually showed me not just, you know, what we saw at the port in the film with packets of heroin kind of slid in between the seams of boxes and packaged by machines that way, but in the offices they showed me, you know, they had heroin woven into carpets, which was incredible to me. I mean, it must have taken somebody weeks to sit there with just this, you know, fine tube of heroin and weaving them between carpets, and on the other end, when it reached its destination, they would have to spend weeks carefully unweaving it. I mean, I guess the point of that is people will go to extreme lengths to smuggle these drugs because there is a massive amount of money involved. You know, for the drug cartels, they can afford to pay people and spend the time to find these ingenious ways of smuggling drugs, because there is literally billions of dollars to be made.
Even though the heroin's so cheap in Pakistan?
It's cheap in Pakistan, but it's not cheap its ultimate destination from Afghanistan is not Pakistan. You know, Pakistan is a poor developing country, and, you know, people can't afford to pay more than, you know, that 50 cents for a hit or whatever. However, people in Australia, people in Europe, people in America can afford to pay a lot more. And ultimately, that is the destination for drug traffickers. It's not Pakistan. Pakistan is on the border, and you know, a lot of it falls off the wagon over there. But the aim of drug smugglers is to get this product to Western lucrative markets where they can earn a lot of money from them.
So tell me about the geopolitics of this then. Is there anything that the Pakistan government can do more, or the police can do more to try and stop it when there's just such a huge volume of drugs coming across the border? Or does the problem, you know, start in Afghanistan? Is that where they need to be looking?
Well, Pakistan, you know, officials in Pakistan will definitely argue that. You know, I had the commander of the Anti-Narcotics Force say to me, why is Pakistan getting a bad reputation when we are suffering as much, if not more, than any other country? We don't produce these drugs. We're not responsible for, you know, growing heroin, I mean, opium, you know, that gets turned into heroin. So why is it that you know, people are kind of giving us a bad name? It's, you know, again, there's no simple solution. Yes, the drugs are being grown in Afghanistan and are moving from Afghanistan through Pakistan. However, the Pakistani government can always do more. I mean, you can always do more to address an issue like this. They definitely face some very serious challenges in trying to address this issue. The massive and porous border with Afghanistan is a major issue, which, you know, they really can't. I mean, unless they just erect a wall, you know, and stop, they can't do much about that. They can increase surveillance, they can increase patrols along there, but, you know, the anti-narcotics force does not have the resources. They are supposed to have 3,000 personnel, funded by the government to deal with this issue, but they have a hiring freeze right now. They can't even have 3,000 because they don't have the money to pay salaries. So.
And when you kind of look at that room, like literally mountains of drugs at the anti-narcotics force, you've got to wonder about the corruption element as well within the law enforcement.
I mean, that is a huge, huge issue. Like I mentioned, you know, there's a lot of money involved in drugs, you know, billions of dollars worth. And, you know, kickbacks happen, like bribes are taken by law enforcement agencies. The ANF, the Anti-Narcotics Force, has a pretty good reputation for not being involved in that, but there are several layers of law enforcement in Pakistan. It's not just them, it's the police, you know, local police, it's the border guards, it's, you know, the excise and taxation department has its own police force. So when you have so many layers, and we have to remember these law enforcement officers aren't on great salaries, so there is always the incentive to make more money by taking kickbacks. And, you know, we had our expert, our narcotics researcher, saying that, yeah, it is extremely common, you know, bribe taking is extremely common in Pakistan, and that also allows the drugs to come in.
A good point's just been raised under our hashtag Pakistan Drugs by Suresh Kumar, who's saying, you know, that of the drug takers, a majority of the population doesn't even have an idea about the risk of sharing needles. I mean, you got some really like harrowing shots of close-ups of that kind of stuff, you know, happening, and people just sort of doing this right out in the open. You know, is there any kind of public health initiatives that help the drug users?
I think, you know, drug users, especially intravenous, you know, drug users are on the margins of society at the best of times. So it is very difficult for them to access of education and awareness and treatment as well. And there did seem to be very little awareness about how, you know, to prevent HIV infection, that they were even vulnerable to HIV infection by sharing needles. There was, you know, in the section of the community that we focused on, they were often uneducated. They hadn't finished, many of them hadn't finished primary school, let alone secondary school. So level of education awareness was, as it is, very, very low. And you are seeing disproportionately high rates of HIV infection amongst Pakistan's intravenous drug users compared to the wider population. I mean, the wider population HIV prevalence rates are quite low. Amongst intravenous drug users, they're actually very high. So it is having an impact. It is causing a lot of problems. And then you also have to wonder about, you know, it's not, HIV is something that doesn't just confine itself to one little group. I mean, it spreads, and a lot of, you know, drug users are married, they have families, you know, they go home, and the potential to spread that disease through their wives and their children is very high. And so there is a major problem, and I know the UNAIDS is concerned about this in Pakistan.
Yeah, tweet us under the hashtag Pakistan Drugs if you're tuning in and watching. We had one tweeter just making a really good point. You know, are there any studies into the demographics of drug users? You know, who are these people? Are they all in low socioeconomic areas, or is it right across the board? Do you have any data on that?
Well, the UNODC report that we quoted extensively in this film is probably the most comprehensive study on drug use in Pakistan to date. It was released in 2012-2013, if I'm not mistaken, and they did extensively look at, you know, who are Pakistan's drug users, and a lot of them tend to be young, which is a problem. You know, most of the drug users tend to be in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, which is the most productive years of a person's life. You know, that's when they're getting married, having families, building up their careers, their jobs, you know, contributing to the economy, contributing to the culture and life of a country. And so if you have the majority of the 6.7 million drug users in Pakistan, in that age bracket, that is a really big problem. I mean, the ramifications of that are greater. And they also mostly tend to be men. However, because Pakistan is a conservative society, I think it is difficult to find out if women, how involved women are in drug addiction. I think that is a really big black hole that we don't really have information on. And of course, when women are involved, children are automatically affected. So it's important to find out, how addicted women are in Pakistan. It's also interesting that it's not a poor person's problem in Pakistan. And I think that's a common misconception about this. It's not just poor people who are involved in this. We heard of many stories. Unfortunately, we didn't have scope in the time that we had for the film to explore this in more detail, but we have middle class people very much involved in this. We have
heroin.
So in heroin, yes. Hashish is incredibly commonly used, and because it is considered a so-called soft drug, we don't know. It's more difficult to find out when a person is having social problems because they're just using hashish too much, But hashish is very commonly used, casually used, I would say. But then heroin is also a big problem amongst the upper class, amongst the middle class. So, drugs are often used as an escape for users. It's, they face a problem in their life, somehow they get introduced to drugs, and it just becomes a way for them to get away from whatever problem that they are facing. And problems aren't, confined to poor people. Everybody, all of us have problems that we need to deal with. So drug addiction is something that has permeated through every age group and every class in Pakistan, much like really anywhere else in the world. But in Pakistan, it seems to be particularly potent because of the easy availability of these drugs and because it is very, very affordable.
You're touching on some really important reasons here, and I know, particularly when you went under that bridge with all the rubbish and you met the kids that were under there, and they were talking about how it's just a way to pass the time. It's kind of a rite of passage. Can you tell us more about that, but also respond to Afaq, who is tweeting us under the hashtag Pakistan Drugs, and she's saying that, the drug problem can't be combated without strengthening mental health policies as well.
Well, it's an interesting point. I have not really thought about that connection too much yet, and it's not something that we touched on in our story at all. But again, as in any developing country, these kind of social issues like mental health, like drug abuse, women's rights in a lot of ways, dealing with unemployment, social problems, they tend to be, lower on the list of priorities. And this is problematic. I mean, Pakistan, does it have the resources to put into issues like this, as many resources that it needs? Does it have the political will to invest in these issues as well? I mean, when we went to Pakistan, it was quite difficult for us to interview government officials about this problem, even though it is such an important problem, because they were too busy dealing with kind of political turmoil. You may remember over the last few months there's been a lot of protests against the government, a lot of strikes, that kind of thing, and that seemed to be taking up literally all the attention of public officials, instead of them devoting their time to social issues like this. We couldn't even get an interview until, in the last day, somebody called it, but again, it was, they were very busy with the political turmoil that was engulfing the country. So it really just, the impression I got was that it was kind of lower on the list of priorities for people.
And tell me about this whole peer pressure thing. I mean, Shehzad says this was, obviously the pull of his friends was really powerful in that while you're following him, he relapses, and anyone who's watching us who hasn't had a chance to watch the film yet should see that, because I think that just speaks towards, how hard it is for people to get off drugs, particularly, teenagers whose friends might still be involved in it.
Well, yeah, and actually it surprised me. I mean, I went to his neighborhood kind of a little bit later than, I met him at the center where he was getting treatment, and he was surrounded by people who were aware and educated about the dangers of drugs and all of that. And it wasn't until I followed him home, really, and he took me under the bridge and introduced me to the neighborhood where he lived, that I really got it. Like, I understood why he had fallen into this. And what really struck me was that he wasn't a bad kid. He wasn't a bad apple in his neighborhood. That everybody did what he did, what he does. Like all the kids his age, younger, older, they were all involved in drug abuse of some sort. Many of them had dropped out of school, like he had. I mean, he was 14, he'd already dropped out of school, which would be illegal in many countries in the world. But his parents had no control. The streets around his neighborhood, there was very little law and order. Drugs were easily available. All the kids knew where to score hashish or heroin or whatever they wanted. It had become normal for children his age to smoke hashish, and then Shehzad had also tried heroin, and it was so normal for them to do it that it didn't occur to Shehzad that what he was doing was weird and he shouldn't be doing it. I mean, if everybody around you likes the color purple, eventually you're going to like the color purple as well, just to fit in. So I think it was a real eye-opener going into his neighborhood.
Yeah, you had a blog that there wasn't much of this included in the film, but you had a blog about kids going through withdrawal in the rehab center that I found really powerful. And for those of us who are following us on the Twitter conversation, #PakistanDrugs, or on the Google Hangout, like, I'd encourage you to read that, because Karishma kind of details, the emotional turmoil that these boys are going through. How hard was it for you to then, walk away from that?
It was hard because I just, I had been privy to something so kind of intense. That rehab center for children is really intense, actually. When you walk in, you don't know what's going on, and you suddenly become aware that you're dealing with children. And it sounds stupid, but I never thought about it before I got there, that I'd be dealing with children who, firstly, I mean, they're teenagers, their hormones are going all over the place as it is. I mean, I remember being a teenager, and really it's an angsty period, and you're pushing the boundaries and kind of being crazy and seeing where you could go. So they're dealing with all the normal teenage issues. They're young boys, so it's even more pronounced for them, because they're really trying to push their boundaries and trying to make that transition between being a child and being a man and an adult, and that kind of thing. But at the same time, they're going through withdrawal, for drug addiction. A lot of them, like Shehzad, had been using drugs for 5-6 years already, and they're just 14. In a space of 3 months, they're suddenly having to deal with all these issues. I think a lot of the reason why these children started using drugs was as a coping mechanism for some kind of trauma in their life, and the drugs helped them in a way to suppress that, to help them to not have to deal with it. But now that they were in the center and they didn't have access to drugs, they had to deal with it. Like, it was bubbling out of them. So and I didn't anticipate any of that before actually getting to the center and spending a few days there, and then kind of figuring out, this is what's happening. It's not just them, trying to leave drugs. They're trying to relearn how to live and figure out for themselves what kind of person they want to be. And these are big, difficult questions for a 14-year-old or a 12-year-old to deal with. And so they would lash out. Sometimes it, again, depends on the personality of each child. But you certainly had boys that were prone to violence. You had boys that were very prone to hurting themselves. You had boys who let their emotions out by abusing other people, especially the staff. And you had boys that would just collapse in an emotional kind of mess. So it was able to kind of jump right into that situation and then suddenly just jump out and try and make sense of it all. So yeah, that was one of the most interesting and probably one of the most kind of personal experiences I had in telling the story.
Well, I'm going to leave the last word for Suresh Kumar, who's just tweeted into us under the hashtag Pakistan Drugs, saying, for too long we've turned a blind eye to such critical issues. It's now time to be responsible in our actions. So I think that's a great way to end this hangout. But I hope you do stick around, Karishma, to answer more of our viewers' questions on the Pakistan Drugs Twitter chat that's still going on, and I'm sure this is definitely not the end of it. We really appreciate you taking the time tonight to give us some of the background of what you learnt on this shoot. It's a fantastic film. For those of you who haven't seen it already, go to the Al Jazeera 101 East website. Drugged Up Pakistan is the name of the film, and Karishma's Twitter handle is @KarishmaTV. You can tweet us and keep using the hashtag Pakistan Drugs. Good night, everyone.
Thank you and good night. Good night.